Okay, I am standing here just west of the Lutheran Theological Seminary, and then the surrounding area, the railroad cut in the distance, the McPherson Barn, and Herbst Woods. And we're going to do a video series called The 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, a line on the colors, close up on the colors. And this is part 1. The 6th Wisconsin, having been the first regiment in the order of march the day before, had been the first regiment in the 1st Corps to cross the Mason-Dixon line and enter Pennsylvania. The morning of July 1st, however, they had been last in the order of march, therefore being last of the men of General John F. Reynolds to reach the field here where I'm standing. They passed through the town of Gettysburg with their national colors unfurled. The regimental band was playing "The Campbells Are Coming." As the men of the 6th arrive at Seminary Ridge, which you see in front of us, Lieutenant Gilbert M. Woodward, an aide to the Iron Brigade's commander, General Slocum Meredith, galloped up to the 6th commander, Lieutenant Colonel Rufus R. Dawes, and he said, "Colonel, form your line and prepare for action." Now, Dawes was in command because the 6th Wisconsin's colonel, Edward S. Bragg, was recuperating in Washington, D.C. after having been kicked by a horse a few weeks back. Dawes had originally been the commander of Company K of the 6th Wisconsin, having been responsible for the formation of the company in Maulston, Wisconsin, just days after Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, had called for 75,000 troops to quell the rebellion. Dawes was a competent officer who had quickly proved his value to the regiment, and the men under his command trusted him completely, even as he had never before led an entire regiment into battle, but rather only a company. Now, Dawes quickly put the orders into action, the evolution of the line being formed at the double quick, with the men loading their muskets as they ran in this direction, singing Yankee Doodle at the quick step. They hastened forward at a run to get into the position on the left flank of the rest of the Iron Brigade, which regiment after regiment was dashing toward the direction in front of us in echelon into the McPherson Woods ahead of me. Now, at the time of the battle, that was actually called Herbst Woods. It later would take its name from the McPherson Barn, and today it's named Reynolds Woods. But at the time of the battle, they would be dashing towards Herbst Woods. Now, if they had completed this maneuver, they would have been the left flank of the 24th Michigan. However, they never got the chance. This has been the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, a line on the colors, close up on the colors, part 1 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, a line on the colors, close up on the colors, part 2 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. We're standing here in a low area between Herbst Woods and the Lutheran Theological Seminary. And in this area, an aide, Lieutenant Martin, galloped in his horse up to Dawes and said, "Colonel, General Doubleday is now in command of the 1st Corps, and he directs you to halt your regiment." Now, what he was referring to was General Abner Doubleday, who was commander of the 3rd Division of 1st Corps. This is the same man who has mythically been credited with inventing the game of baseball. Now, Dawes replied, ordering the men of the 6th to lie down facing the woods. And they laid down here in this position that I am standing at now. Now, unknown to Dawes and the men of the 6th, General Reynolds had been shot in the head and killed instantly while deploying the rest of the Iron Brigade into the woods. Now, there's been a lot of conjecture about where Reynolds was when he received his fatal shot, and that was something that I covered extensively in my Forward for God's Sake Forward video series. But there's been a lot of conflicting reports from the men of the Iron Brigade about when they themselves learned about the fate of John Reynolds. Now, Private James P. Sullivan, known as Mickey to his comrades in the regiment, claimed later in a memoir that a very boyish staff officer galloped up to our commanding officer, who was Dawes, and I heard him say, "General Reynolds is killed, and General Doubleday is in command and directs your regiment." Now, Mickey's story is unlikely, as Dawes, being the commander that Mickey was referring to, did not find out about the death of Reynolds until later on in the day. Others in the 6th Wisconsin claim that they figured it out on their own, as they either recognized the officers approaching Dawes as being aides to General Abner Doubleday, or through not recognizing the aides, figured out that something terrible had happened to John F. Reynolds and that somebody else was leading the 1st Corps. Now, as the 6th lay here in reserve in this field, the commander of the brigade guard, being the order of march with the 6th, reported Dawes for duty in the impending battle. The brigade guard consisted of 2 officers and 100 men, which Dawes split into 2 50-man companies, placing one on the left flank of the regiment and one on the right flank of the regiment. This raised the total strength of the regiment to 340 able-bodied soldiers and officers, just over 1/3 of the strength that they'd left Madison, Wisconsin with 2 years prior. Now, the regiment had been depleted through combat actions at Bronner's Farm, 2nd Bull Run, South Mountain, Antietam, and Chancellorsville, not to mention the effects on them from disease, which was the most common reason for a regiment to lose its strength during the American Civil War. At this point, the 6th Wisconsin was the only regiment of Wadsworth's division, that is, 11 regiments in 2 brigades, that was not yet engaged on the battlefield, the rest of them being engaged directly in front of us near Herbst Woods. The rest of the Iron Brigade, made up of the Wisconsin regiments, the Indiana Regiment, and the aforementioned 24th Michigan, were under the command of General Meredith and were involved in a hot firefight in the woods with the brigade of General James J. Archer's Alabamans and Tennesseans. General Lysander Cutler's brigade, composed of New Yorkers, Hoosiers, and Pennsylvanians, were on the far right of the Union line, mostly on the other side of the Chambersburg Pike, which you see there directly in front of us. And they were engaged with regiments of General Joseph Davis, brigade of Mississippians and Tar Heels. Now, Davis was related to President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. It wasn't long before the Confederates under Davis were getting an upper hand on the Union boys north of the Chambersburg Pike, and soon the men of Cutler's brigade began to give way, retreating in order toward the east. Now, Lieutenant Meredith Jones, who was an aide to General Doubleday, came up to Dawes in great haste right here in this area. And he said, "Colonel, General Doubleday directs you to move your regiment at once to the right," as the rebels were driving Cutler's men hard back toward the town. Now, Cutler, incidentally, had been the original colonel of the 6th Wisconsin, serving in that capacity until he was wounded in the thigh at the Battle of Bronner's Farm in August of 1862. Later, he'd been promoted to brigadier general and placed in command of the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Corps, which he led here today on the battlefield. The men of the 6th still held their old commander in high regard and would continue to do so for the rest of their lives. Dawes now ordered the 6th to get to their feet and file right march. And the regiment moved at the double quick northward in columns of 4 toward the Chambersburg Pike. Some of the men Dawes included later claimed at this point They saw the body of General John F. Reynolds being carried to the rear in a blanket. Dawes said he was not aware that General Reynolds had been killed, however. This has been the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, a line on the colors, close up on the colors, part 2 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Wisconsin at Gettysburg, a line on the colors, close up on the colors, part 3 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. From our last video, we were right here in the low area between the Lutheran Theological Seminary and Herbst Woods, where General John F. Reynolds was killed. And we began the march along with the 6th Wisconsin toward where our camera is, toward the Chambersburg Pike. Now, the Chambersburg Pike was framed, as it is today, by 2 wooden fences, one per side. And as the column approached these fences, the regiment, fanning out into a battle line parallel to the pike and the fences. Now, ahead of them, the men of the 6th could see the guns of Hall's battery. Now, as we get closer to the Chambersburg Pike, we'll see Hall's battery over here. Now, they seen the guns of Hall's battery driving hard to the rear. The men of the 147th New York and 76th New York and the 56th Pennsylvania Regiment of Cutler's Brigade were in full retreat. The 147th had been well north of the pike when 3 regiments of Joe Davis's brigade had swept down upon them. The 76th and 56th Pennsylvania had been caught while forming their battle lines by a rebel that extended far beyond their exposed right flank. And the converging rebel fire from the east and the north was devastating. After a gallant but short-lived stand, the Union line collapsed. Many of the running New Yorkers, including Captain J.W. Pierce of the 147th New York, would later sharply deny all claims that they had to be rescued by the men of Wisconsin, or by any other regiment for that matter, as they would soon reform on Seminary Ridge. To the left of the 6th Wisconsin's position, 2 remaining regiments of Cutler's Brigade, the 14th Brooklyn and the 95th Pennsylvania, were slowly falling back. The rest of the Iron Brigade either had forced the men of Archer's brigade back, or they soon would. The men of the 2nd Wisconsin, having wounded and captured General Archer himself, as well as his second in command, Colonel Burkett D. Fry. Now, Dawes, on horseback in front of his regiment, scanned the scene before him. He could see the men of Davis' brigades pursuing Cutler's men, firing into the backs of the fleeing Federals. A few of the rebels saw the Wisconsinites on their flank and turned to fire at them as they formed their lines. Suddenly, Dawes' horse reared and plunged, sending the lieutenant colonel sprawling to the ground. Just 3 days short of his 25th birthday, Dawes quickly rose to his feet with his hands to the sky, and he shouted, "I'm all right, boys," to his men, who gave a hearty cheer. The mare, with a ball in her breast, quickly removed herself to the rear, and the men opening a gap in their lines to allow her through. Dawes would later be on foot for the rest of the day. Now, the regiment closed here on this first fence, where they were ordered to halt and fire by company into the flank of the advancing rebels, their rifles on the rails of the fence. Now, these volleys were devastating to the Confederates, checking their advance and forcing them to search for cover, which they did in the form of the unfinished railroad cut, roughly 175 paces north of the Chambersburg Pike. Now, as the sky and the surrounding area filled with smoke of the battle, Many of the Wisconsin men thought that the rebels had jumped into a creek or a riverbed. Others, like Mickey Sullivan, thought that the ground had just simply swallowed them up. The sixth was the rebels soon dispelled this myth. However, as they raised their heads above the ridge of the cut, they began firing into the Wisconsin line. Dawes ordered the men to climb both fences and to reform on the other side. The movement was so clumsy, even for the men such as an esteemed regiment, as there's no way to get 400 men over a pair of fences, even under the best of circumstances. The 6th was doing it from under fire from the men in the cut. The fire was so severe and the men falling rapidly, with those that were wounded turning and moving to the rear. At the second fence, the Company K's commander, Captain John Ticknor, took a ball through his torso, and he made for the rear, collapsing and dying after recrossing the Chambersburg Pike, which you see directly in front of us. He died in this position where we're standing here now at the first fence. The men of the 6th were now shooting as fast as they could, while forming up, attempting to beat down the incessant rebel fire. Dawes, realizing that they could not put up, but rather would need to charge the cut or leave the field, lest they be massacred, saw the commander of the 95th New York, Major Edward Pye, on his left. Running to meet the major, Dawes said, "We must charge." Pye replied, "Charge it is." This has been part 3 of the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg. A line on the colors, close up on the colors, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Okay, we're here at the second fence on the Chambersburg Pike. We just came from the direction that our camera's facing, the first fence over there. We're starting to see men being wounded, falling back across the street. And there began an order to charge the railroad cut, which is 175 paces in front of us, just before that row of corn, and we're going to walk that 175 paces. The order for the 6th to charge came down by company. The color guard and those companies adjacent to it stepping off first. As each company put a bit of distance between themselves and the one that was adjacent to it, the next one would step off in echelon to the one before it, causing the entire regiment to charge in a V formation. The color guard at the point, with Dawes among them, and the brigade guard companies on the flanks. Men continued to fall in this area and then would struggle to the rear. Now, according to Dawes, the firing from the railroad cut was fearful and destructive, an unbroken roar before us. Men were being shot by the 20s and 30s and breaking ranks by falling or running. But the boys crowded in right and left toward the colors, and it continued forward. Lieutenant Lloyd G. Harris of Company C, while passing by the stationary 95th New York Regiment, ran to the New Yorkers and shouted at an unnamed officer, "For God's sake, why don't you move forward and join our left?" The New Yorkers did not advance. According to the statement made by Harris after the war, the 95th did rally and reform their regiment and deserved great praise for it. But they never joined the left of the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers. That place was occupied by the Iron Brigade Guard. The 95th came up later, helping to mop up the regiments of Mississippians once the colors had been captured, firing into the fleeing members of the 42nd Mississippi and the 55th North Carolina. When the matter was still unsettled, however, they failed to respond, and the truth of history compels me to state that the 6th Wisconsin, with the Brigade Guard, charged singly and alone. Dawes, in a position now directly behind the color guard, only gave one command throughout this 175-pace charge, yelling, "A line on the colors, close up on the colors." He shouted this order incessantly, and the men obeyed it by closing the gaps and moving toward the color guard. On they ran through the hailstorm of gunfire, shot, and shell, each man expecting his next step to be his last. The men in the color guard dropping one after another until Dawes himself grabbed the staff, only to be shouldered by the last remaining man of the guard. They reached the edge of the railroad cut, and the gunfire increased. With so many men on both sides holding their fire until this moment, then pouring it on point-blank range into the man in front of them. The rebels in the cut, belonging to the 2nd Mississippi Regiment, were mostly planters and farmers from Tishomingo, Tippah, and Itawamba and Potomac counties. They were as elite as any regiment in the Confederate Army, having served with distinction at every major battle that was in the Civil War up to this point. At Bull Run, they had been a part of Bernard Bee's brigade when he had famously labeled General Thomas J. Jackson with the moniker Stonewall. They'd seen action at Seven Pines, Gaines Mill, Malvern Hill, 2nd Bull Run in South Mountain, as well as Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. And although today they would not be a good day for that regiment, the 2nd Mississippi would continue to fight on, serving the Confederacy by fighting at Falling Waters, Bristow Station, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, beside a church, Weldon Railroad, and other battles as well. The Mississippians, now trapped in the railroad cut, had a distinct disadvantage now, not being able to see just how many Union soldiers were standing above them. The cut, sometimes as wide as 15 or 20 feet, was more than 6 feet deep in places, which explains why the regiment hadn't been able to fire cohesive volleys at the charging Wisconsinites. The rebels needing to climb the sides of the cut just to see over the edge. All along the line there was firing and the sounds of bayonets clanking. To the left, Dawes, the colors of the 2nd Mississippi, flew defiantly above the cut, drawing a great amount of attention from the boys of the 6th. Private Cornelius Oakley of Company I was shot through the arm in his rush to capture the flag. Corporal Lewis Eggleston of Company H was shot and mortally wounded in the attempt to seize it. Private Anderson of Eggleston's company, furious at the shooting of his comrade, swung his musket and split the skull of the rebel who had shot Eggleston. Private John O. Johnson, while attempting to protect Eggleston, whom he considered his best friend in the company, was shot through the arm. Nearby, Private John Harlan of Company I was shot as he advanced on the flag, his body sliding into the cut and resting at the feet of the rebel who killed him. Private Levi Tongue aimed his musket point blank at the rebel who shot Harlan, who cried, "Don't shoot! Don't kill me!" Tongue responded, "All hell can't save you now," and pulled the trigger. Meanwhile, Dawes was staring into the cut, searching it for the rebel commander. "Where is the colonel of this regiment?" he shouted. Major John Blair of the 2nd Mississippi responded, "Here I am. Who are you?" Dawes, entering the cut now, much to the disdain of his men who worried for his safety, pushed past several rebels who were still armed with loaded muskets. He said, "I command this regiment. Surrender, or I will fire." Major Blair said nothing, but instead promptly handed his sword to Dawes, causing the rebels in the general vicinity to drop their muskets, their officers surrendering their swords and pistols to the officers of the 6th Wisconsin. This has been the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, a line on the colors, Close Up on the Colors, Part 4, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. 6 Wisconsin at Gettysburg, A Line on the Colors, Close Up on the Colors, Part 5, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. While in the railroad cut to the left of Dawes, the fight for the colors of the 2nd Mississippi continued. Holding the flag was Corporal W.B. Murphy, a brave Mississippian who would somehow survive this fight and later write in the following report, "My color guards were all killed and wounded in less than 5 minutes. And also my colors were shot more than a dozen times, and the flag's staff was hit and splintered 2 or 3 times. The Wisconsinites continued to rush him, being all killed or wounded in the attempt. Still they rushed on," Murphy said, "rushing for my flag, and there were over a dozen shot down like sheep in the mad rush for the colors." He saw Captain Remington of the 6th Company I shot down along with the rest of them. Then a large man made a rush for me and the flag. As I tore the flag from the staff, he took a hold of me and the colors. The firing was still going on and was kept for several minutes after the flag was taken from me. That large man was Corporal Frank Waller of the 6th Wisconsin Company I. "Soon after I got the flag," Waller would later say, "there were men from all the companies there. I did take the flag out of the color bearer's hand, and I thought about making for the rear, but then I thought I'd stay, and I threw it down, loaded, and fired twice while standing on it." The following year, Waller would be presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor for his action here, where we're standing, at the railroad cut on July 1st, 1863. More than 100 years later, the struggle between Corporal Waller and Corporal Murphy for the colors of the 2nd Mississippi would be immortalized forever in the famous Don Trione painting, "Fight for the Colors." From the 6th perspective, to the right of the colors, the firing diminished, the men of the 6th imploring the Mississippians to "throw down your muskets, down with your muskets." A few of the Mississippians attempted to escape by climbing out the back side of the railroad cut and were quickly shot down or captured. Slowly, the firing became sporadic before ceasing altogether. It was over. No more than 20 minutes had passed since Lieutenant Jones had delivered Doubleday's order for Dawes to move his regiment to the right. In this same 20 minutes, we have actually walked and spent 20 minutes walking the same direction here to the railroad cut. The 6th Wisconsin had captured 7 officers and 225 enlisted men of the 2nd Mississippi Regiment, along with their colors. According to Lieutenant Colonel Dawes, of the 420 men who had started from the turnpike, only 240 of them had reached the cut. Of the 33 men of Company K, only 8 were left standing. These numbers were typical of all the 6 companies. By the end of the day, Dawes would be the only field officer left standing, not only the 6th Wisconsin Regiment, but in the entire Iron Brigade, who, like the 6th, had paid dearly for their victory in the McPherson Woods. It had been a high-priced victory for the entire 1st Corps. By the end of the day, however, after Ewell's Corps arrived on the field to the north, Union forces holding this ground would be overrun and routed, retreating back through the town to reform on the hills to the south. The 6th Wisconsin would spend the remainder of the battle Culp's Hill. This has been the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, A Line on the Colors, Close Up on the Colors, Part 5, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And while we're here doing this video on the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, I wanted to mention a little story that happened in the mid-1990s. As you can see, the 6th Wisconsin's monument here, and you can also see their left flank marker here. Back in the mid-90s, a man, while walking along this railroad cut with his dog, found some bones. And these bones were located right here near this bush in front of us. And for some years afterward, an American flag would sit there. As he went over and inspected, he had the premonition that these bones were not animal bones, that they may have been human bones. And of course, he got a hold of the National Park Service, and they came out here and excavated, and they found almost a complete skeleton of a soldier. This soldier may have been a Union soldier from the 6th Wisconsin. It may have been a Confederate soldier in the fight here at the railroad cut from the 2nd Mississippi, or maybe one of the other regiments of Lysander Cutler's brigade's troops, or some of the men from Davis's brigade as well. But I think it's important to note that even today, 150 years later, after the Battle of Gettysburg, from time to time, a bullet, a shell fragment, or maybe even a body can still turn up here on the Gettysburg National Military Park because of the devastation that happened here during these 3 days where 52,000 men had become casualties and millions of bullets and artillery shells had been fired. This has been Secrets of the Battlefield, the remains of a soldier in the railroad cut, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Okay, I am here on Culp's Hill, and this is going to be the 6th Wisconsin, a line on the colors, close on the colors, part 6 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And it's also going to be Secrets of the Battlefield on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. The 6th Wisconsin, as we left off in part 5, had retreated from the west side of town, which is in this direction here. And I'll show you in a later video inside of the National Cemetery the route that they came from. But they came up to the northwestern slope of Culp's Hill to build earthworks. They retreated south through the town and were placed on the north slope of Culp's Hill, where they constructed earthworks. Now, when the Iron Brigade was fighting west of town near the Herbst Woods on the first day, one of the criticisms that was given after the war was that they didn't entrench in between the lull and the action on the morning of July 1st, and then they're fighting again in the afternoon. Now, one of the reasons for this, and it was later brought up by Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Dawes, that his regimental wagon didn't join the 6th Wisconsin until it reached Culp's Hill. And inside of that wagon were entrenching tools. There was a dozen spades and shovels that could be used to build earthworks. And that was the reason that Lieutenant Colonel Dawes gave for it, which kills the criticism. Now, the 6th was on the right of the Iron Brigade up here, and they constructed some of the first earthworks that were built on Culp's Hill. And Culp's Hill would be the salvation of the Union Army, as we've seen on other videos, such as the 137th New York's defense of Culp's Hill and the Traverse, the 66th Ohio, 23rd Pennsylvania, and some other regiments that fought up here in the fighting on Culp's Hill on July 2nd and July 3rd, 1863. Now, the secret is that the 6th Wisconsin has a marker up here on Culp's Hill. It's very little known about, not often visited, and I'm going to show you how to get there. When you come through Spangler Spring and by Culp's Hill and you're coming up to the tower, as you see this truck coming here, you usually make this right-hand turn and then head right up there to the tower, which you can see in the distance. Now, where I'm standing right now, when you make this right-hand turn, you'll see this boulder here, and then you'll see a tree in the distance. Well, as soon as you come to this boulder, if you walk into the woods, and I've marked it with a flag today to make it easier for us to see as we walk down, But if you turn right about here and you walk into the woods, you're now going to see the marker for the 6th Wisconsin in their position on July 2nd and 3rd, 1863. And we're going to take a look at some of the original earthworks that they helped to construct. Here's their marker, and it says 6th Wisconsin Regiment, July 2nd and 3rd, 1863. Those entrenching tools that Lieutenant Colonel Dawes spoke about that he didn't get until he got to Culp's Hill were brought here, and they were used to dig earthworks. And you can see right here in the ground in front of me, I'll put the camera down low to the ground, you can see right here there's a dip in the ground and then it goes up. And this is, I'm standing right now inside of some of the earthworks that the 6th Wisconsin built. And this is what remains of the original earthworks. All across the battlefield are reconstructed earthworks that the park put in. These are some of the original earthworks that are left here, not too far from the 6th Wisconsin Regiment marker that marks their spot on July 2nd and July 3rd, 1863. So I thought it would be really neat to add this to our 6th Wisconsin Align the Colors, Close on the Colors video series to show that they not only fought on July 1st, but also on 2nd and 3rd, 1863, and I'll point that out in a closing video. This has been the 6th Wisconsin Regiment, Align on the Colors, Close on the Colors, and Secrets of the Battlefield, the 6th Wisconsin Regiment marker for their July and 2nd action, and the earthworks that they constructed, some of the first, if not the first, earthworks on Culp's Hill, on Part 6 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Be the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, Align on the Colors, Close on the Colors, Part 7 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. I am standing here on the edge of Culp's Hill near the 137th New York Monument. On July 2nd, after retreating from the west side of town, heading through the town of Gettysburg and then up and over East Cemetery Hill onto Culp's Hill, the regiment built some earthworks, which we just took a look at rather in Part 6, which are over on the north slope of Culp's Hill in that direction, on the 2nd of July of 1863. Also, they marched by the right flank over to this area right here when the 137th New York was defending this area, and you can go back and watch my 6-part video series called the 137th New York and their defense of Culp's Hill and the Traverse. The 6th Wisconsin took a small role in that action when there was a traverse that was constructed just in front of us about 30 yards there. The 6th marched to the right flank of the 137th New York, where the traverse had been constructed. And somewhere near the traverse drove Confederate troops from that position facing the southern direction in which our camera is at now. They remained here until about midnight or just after midnight of July 3rd, when they were relieved by Kane's brigade. The 6th Wisconsin Regiment of the Iron Brigade, since they remained and fought here just around midnight or just after midnight, are probably rather one of the few regiments of all of them that fought at Gettysburg that fought on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. Remember, the 1st and 11th Corps, the 1st Corps being the corps that the 6th Wisconsin was a part of, were the only two corps that were here at the time of the morning of July 1st. A lot of corps didn't arrive onto the field until after the first day's battles were over, or even on the second or the third day. So a lot of regiments can never say that they fought on all 3 days of the battlefield. The 6th Wisconsin is one of the few regiments that did. And on the evening of July 2nd into the 3rd of 1863, after building earthworks on the north end of Culp's Hill, they came down here to the right flank of the 137th New York and helped to defend the traverse that was built. And you'll want to again go back and watch my video series entitled The 137th New York Volunteers Defense of Culp's Hill and the Traverse. This has been part 7 of the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, A Line on the Colors, Close on the Colors, part 7 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This is the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, A Line on the Colors, Close up on the Colors, part 8 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I want to take this time to look over the 6th Wisconsin's monument, which sits here at the railroad cut bridge in the field of the 175 paces from the Chambersburg Pike to the railroad cut, where they captured the colors of the 2nd Mississippi. Now, this monument was dedicated by the state of Wisconsin on June the 30th, 1888. It originally stood about 50 feet to the west, which is today where the bridge stands. And the monument had to be relocated when this bridge was built in the 1960s. The monument's made of red granite, and it stands 11 feet 7 inches tall. The 5-sided symbol at the top of it represents the Iron Brigade. The circle on the front is the symbol of the 1st Union's Army Corps, and the other symbols include an eagle with crossed flags, crossed rifles, a knapsack, and the Wisconsin State Seal. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at this monument from all 4 sides. For someone that's never visited the Gettysburg National Military Park or been to Gettysburg, it'll give you the opportunity to see this monument from all 4 sides. First, we're going to look here at the north side. On the north side of the monument has the Iron Brigade symbol at the top, and then has the regiments of the Iron Brigade: 6th Wisconsin, 7th Wisconsin, 24th Michigan, 19th Indiana, 2nd Wisconsin. As we pan down, you'll see the knapsack with the crossed rifles, but you'll also see the black hat that these regiments were famous for wearing. And then it says 6th Wisconsin Volunteers, and of course they were first in everything: 1st Brigade, 1st Division, 1st Corps. 1st Brigade under Meredith, 1st Division under Wadsworth, 1st Army Corps under Reynolds, and then Doubleday. And then of course their moniker, the Iron Brigade. To the east side, facing the town of Gettysburg, you see the state seal, and it says, on July 2nd and 3rd, this regiment lay on Culp's Hill on the evening of the 2nd. It moved to support Greene's brigade and assisted to the repulse of Johnson's division. Number who lost their lives in battle in the 6th Wisconsin Regiment during the war: killed 163, died of wounds 71, total casualties 234. And then it also has the maker of the monument, which was B&M Granite Company out of Montello, Wisconsin. As we face the Chambersburg Pike, where the regiment came from, to the south, and we look at this from the south end, the monument is vacant other than the, again, Iron Brigade symbol at the top, which is identical to the northern side of the monument. Nothing was ever inscribed here on this side. As we walk up the slope of this bridge that crosses the railroad cut, which was built in the 1960s, where the monument originally sat, we look at the monument here from the west side. And on the west side talks about the charge made on the railroad cut. It has the eagle, the flag, and the seal, and it says, in the charge made on this railroad cut, the 2nd Mississippi Regiment officers, men, and battle flags surrendered to the 6th Wisconsin. And notice that when they put this, they didn't say they surrendered to the 95th New York or they surrendered to the 56th Pennsylvania. They said they surrendered to the 6th Wisconsin. Again, as we stated in an earlier video, this regiment made this charge across this field unsupported. Lost in the 6th Wisconsin, killed here 30, wounded 116, missing 22, for a total of 168. And again, this is the west side of the monument and all four sides of the monument to the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers of the Iron Brigade. This has been the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, a line on the colors, close up on the colors, Part 8, a look at the monument, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Okay, I am standing here in the Gettysburg National Cemetery, and this is going to be the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, a line on the colors, close up on the colors, Part 9, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I want to give you a little bit of a point of vantage where we were at earlier today. As I look over here in the distance between these two trees, I can see the Gettysburg College campus bell tower. And that tells me that that is the north end of town, not far from where Mule's Confederates came. When we were shooting the videos on the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, it was in the direction that my camera is facing now, which is the western end of town. Now, after the first day of the Battle at the Railroad Cut, which we did in the first several parts of the videos, the 6th Wisconsin retreated back through the town. Now, when they retreated back through the town, it appears that they moved toward the southwestern end of the town, almost in the direction where they came from, not far from where like Colt Park is today. And then they turned into this direction, coming up directly in front of the camera, and eventually would pass right through this ground here into this direction behind the soldiers' monument here at the Gettysburg National Cemetery, and they would go across East Cemetery Hill onto the northern slope of Culp's Hill, which is directly in front of my camera now. Now, the thing that's ironic about this area here that the soldiers from the 6th Wisconsin moved across to get here is that if we walk over here, you will see that there's 73 bodies from the state of Wisconsin buried in this plot. And it's not beyond the shadow of anyone's doubt to imagine that it's quite possible that the soldiers from the 6th Wisconsin Iron Brigade passed right over this ground here, which later several of them would be interred in. When Lincoln would come back a few months later and dedicate this very part of the battlefield as a final resting place for those who gave their lives. This plot here is the Wisconsin plot. It's where several men from the 6th Wisconsin, some of which we had even mentioned in the fight at the railroad cut, lay here immortalized forever. And we're going to take a look at them now. There is the grave of Charles Harre, and it's spelled H-A-R-R-E in records, but it's also H-A-S-S-E. And he was in Company F of the 6th Regiment. Ernst Schenderbach. Now, I also have Ernst Scheinerbachen of Company H. Sergeant Andrew Miller, Company I. Palmer, Company A. Abraham Fletcher, Company K. John Scott, Company D. Here's one that we mentioned in the fight for the railroad cut. Lewis H. Eggleston. Now I also have it listed as Lewis W. Eggleston, fighting for the flag. Leon Stedeman, Company I. Henry Anderson, Company B. Sergeant William Gollop, Company D. Edward Lehman, Company E. I also have that spelled as Edward Lehman, L-E-E-M-A-N. James Kelly, Company B. William E. Evans, Company B. And then, of course, unknown. There may have been some unknown soldiers from the 6 Wisconsin Volunteers included in some of these unknown Wisconsin plots. But again, where we're standing here is a very possible, if not close or exact route that the 6 Wisconsin retreated through the town, the southwest end of town, coming over which would be the Chambersburg Pike, and then just beyond this stone wall here is today the Taneytown Road. And I'll post some photographs of this area from 1863 so you can just see how much of an open field it was. But they pretty much went straight by what would be some of their final resting spots of their comrades, over by the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse, across the East Cemetery Hill, and then finally to the north slope of Culp's Hill. This has been part 9 of the 6th Wisconsin at Gettysburg, a line on the colors, close up on the colors, inside the National Cemetery at the Wisconsin plot on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Okay, I am here at the Lutheran Seminary Complex, and today we're going to talk about a little known piece of Gettysburg history. Anytime you involve yourself in the study of the Battle of Gettysburg, there's a lot of whys. Why didn't Mule take that hill? What caused the Union Army to crumble on the first day? How did the Union Army eventually win the battle when it seemed like on the first day they were being routed? What saved them? You know, and a lot of times you hear about different regiments or different officers from that battle. This officer did this. This regiment protected the retreat and sacrificed themselves. And a lot of times it's, you know, it's the infantry, it's the artillery, it's the cavalry, it's a certain officer. But often the civilian and the lesser known army personnel are left behind to history. And one such story that was first published in the Milwaukee Sunday Telegraph on July 30th, 1882, talks about a specific heroic action that took place here on the Gettysburg battlefield in this area on July 1st, 1863. And it was later called by General Hancock himself the Mule Train Charge at Gettysburg. So this is going to be the Mule Train Charge at Gettysburg, Part 1. And this is the story of a man named Jerome um, A. Waltrus. And Jerome A. Waltrus was detached. He was a sergeant that was detached with the 6th Wisconsin, and he was in charge of an ammunition train. And here on July 1st, 1863, while back in the town of Gettysburg, he heard about the morning rout of troops over in this area under in the First Corps under Reynolds. Reynolds was killed. Wadsworth's and Meredith's and Cutler's brigades were being torn up here just west of town by overwhelming numbers of Confederate troops. And by mid-afternoon, the situation became drastic when Union soldiers, and more specifically Union soldiers of the Iron Brigade, started to run near empty on ammunition. Now, at this point, these soldiers were probably beaten. They were being pushed back, and they would eventually be pushed back through the town. However, while being pushed back through the town, if they would have ran out of ammunition totally, they probably would have been destroyed, and the Confederates could have routed the Union soldiers here before giving them the opportunity to entrench themselves on the high ground back at Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. And Jerome A. Waltrus, who was detached with the 6th Wisconsin, volunteered to take a 10-team mule wagon train filled with ammunition and distribute it, after receiving an order, distribute it to troops in this area on July 1st, 1863. And that's what this story is going to be about. This has been the Mule Train Charge at Gettysburg, Part 1, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Train Charge at Gettysburg, Part 2. And by noon of July 1st, 1863, the Union Army had been in deep trouble. The First Corps, fighting over here near Herbst Woods, was in deep trouble as their ammunition began to run out. Their commanding officer, John Fulton Reynolds, had been killed about an hour before, and Confederate troops advancing from the west and from the north of town began pushing back both the 11th and the First Corps. Waltrus returned to his train, and not too long after that, a staff officer under 1st Division Commander Wadsworth came to him and told him that they needed ammunition as quickly as possible. Now, Jerome Waltrus went along the line of drivers, and he found a driver from the 7th Wisconsin named Burt, and he told him that he wanted him and his team to the front. And Burt, with 9 other wagons, began their charge with their wagon train out into this area. They passed by the Lutheran Theological Seminary, just to the right side of the building there, where you see Valentine Hall, and then proceeded down this direction where you see the modern buildings today, and then of course the YWCA and that modern house there. Their wagon train came into this area, and this is where they first came among the battle lines of July 1st, 1863. Now, the roads that were leading up to this point were very good, and the order that were given down to each driver was to keep the mules running, and do not stop until the specific order had been given to do so. The train passed through the northwest into town and then came here into the Lutheran Theological Seminary when it finally came down into the battle line. Now, when Jerome Waltrus came here, a major came out to him and said, "Stop that wagon or it's going to become captured." And Jerome Waltrus had already received his orders from Wadsworth telling him to get ammunition out here as soon as possible. So, of course, he shook off that officer, that major, and told him that I have received orders to deliver the ammunition and that's exactly what I'm going to do. And before long, his wagon was out in the open field just behind Union lines, and we're going to take over there in part 3, just in the distance where you see the Herbst Woods, the clearing between Herbst Woods and the McPherson barn, not too far from the spot where John Fulton Reynolds was killed, most likely just an hour before this wagon train arrived. This has been the Mule Train Charge at Gettysburg, Part 2, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. The Mule Train Charge at Gettysburg, Part 3. And we had just left off at a point of chaos. Jerome A. Walters passed the Lutheran Theological Seminary, headed in this direction. John Reynolds, 1st Corps commanders, killed here about an hour before. Brigadier General Abner Doubleday is now in command. Union troops from the 1st Corps defending this area, and from the 11th Corps defending an area north of town, are beginning to be routed by Confederate troops, and they're running out of ammunition. An order is given to bring ammunition to the front as soon as possible. Jerome A. Walters obeys that order, has a team of 10 wagon trains headed in this area when he's stopped by a major and ordered to stop, or his wagon train will be captured. But be given the order, he ignores that and comes out, and he's into this area here. We are here right along Herbst Woods, not far from the spot in the direction over here where John F. Reynolds was just killed. We're about out in the middle of the field on the south side of the McPherson barn. And just above us, the ridge that you see, at that point in the battle, the fighting with the Iron Brigade, back and forth in this area. The wagon train arrives in this area here in the open fields just beyond the Lutheran Seminary building, and it was under fire of about 12 Confederate artillery pieces, probably several of them from Pegram's artillery, which was about a half a mile in front of us. The wagons come into this area just behind Union lines, and they form a semicircle, and then finally order comes to stop, and they stop. And workers in the back of the wagons, other teamsters, begin tumbling boxes of ammunition off of these wagons onto the ground behind the Union lines. Now, Jerome A. Walters, who had jumped off the wagon just a little bit in the distance, was running behind those wagons with an axe in his hand, and he began to get these boxes that were being tumbled off the wagons and split them open, making it even easier for Federal soldiers of the Iron Brigade to get to the ammunition. They had around 75,000 rounds on these 10 wagons, which they were able to get most of them off onto the ground and split open in this area. And that's the truly heroic action of Walters and his team here, that they were able to come here under fire, get these wagons being shot at by shot and shell close enough to Union lines, and even distribute and break open the boxes so that this ammunition could be distributed. Men who were running out of ammunition near the end to get them approximately 60 rounds per man, which would show to be sufficient enough to allow them to hold back as long as possible the Confederate advance in this area, long enough for the next Federal commander, Winfield Scott Hancock, and his 2nd Corps to arrive and bolster the heights on the town, and then take over as the commanding officer here until General Meade can arrive himself. An order had been given for Hancock to take over as soon as he arrived on the battlefield. So this action by Walters and his team here bought a very, very valuable time for these Federal soldiers back at East Cemetery Hill to bolster that line. It bought time for Winfield Scott Hancock to arrive, and it also purchased valuable time for soldiers of the 1st and 11th Corps who began retreating here. At this point, Walters, after distributing most of the ammunitions, began to order his wagons back in town, and the way he did that was he pointed in the distance at the Chambersburg Pike, and we'll take over there on our next video series. This has been the Mule wagon charge at Gettysburg, Part 3 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Mule train charge at Gettysburg, Part 4. And I am standing here just east of the McPherson Barn along the Chambersburg Pike in the historic peach orchard in which General Lee made his headquarters on July 1st, 1863, near that upright cannon there. His headquarters were actually in this peach orchard. The Mary Thompson House is nearby. That is the unofficial spot of Lee's headquarters. Now, when Jerome Walters, we left off, he had distributed as much of the 75,000 rounds of ammunition as possible. He came under artillery fire and ordered his men to head back toward the town. And the order that he gave was that the soldiers in these wagon trains should give the rest of the ammunition to any Union soldier that needed it from this point on. So they were just to toss them out as regiments were passing by, seeing ammunition trains. If any commanders would come up and say, our men need ammunition, they were to dump the boxes off onto the ground and distribute it as seen fit. Just as the wagon train left the McPherson Barn area and headed in the direction of this peach orchard here along the Chambersburg Pike, it came under heavy artillery fire. And one of the things that took place during that retreat of the wagon train was that some of the mules were killed. There was one such instance by a driver named Indiana where he began riding away, and his mule had both hind legs shot right off. And as the mule landed stumps on the ground, the shock on the driver's face was that a couple other teamsters that were in the wagon unfortunately had to unhitch the animal and shoot it to put it out of its misery. Other animals were also, there was another mule that was shot and mortally wounded and also was put down here. And then one of the wagons had its wheel shot off as well. So at this point, headed in the direction toward where our camera facing, Walters and whatever wagons he could get out of here began heading back into town. Now, one of General Wadsworth's staff officers watched all this action that we just talked about in the last couple parts in amazement and witnessed it. And he would later put it in a battle report. Now, when Walters got back into the town began getting crowded with fleeing soldiers. And they turned toward the right where the 11th Corps was falling back into the town in disarray and order. Now, the Confederates were so close behind them that Federal officers were firing their revolvers at them. O'Connor stood in the wagon bed to fire his revolver, and finally a New York regiment finally drove some Confederates backwards. Now, when they finally reached the rallying point back on Cemetery Hill, Major Winfield Scott Hancock had the orders in his hand to take over command of the army, and that was from Major Reynolds. When Walters and his wagons finally reached that point, a man walked up to him after Walters had just moments before that seen General Oliver Howard. He was sitting upon his horse, and he wrote later that he was sitting upon his horse as if he was watching a 4th of July parade. Well, a man walks up to Walters and he says to him, "Good God, what have you got here? What have you got a wagon here for? You haven't been into action." And Jerome Walters nodded back at him and he said, "Yes, sir, I just came back with the rear guard." And then finally the man says, "Well, did you lose all your ammunition?" And Walters answered to him, "No, sir, I distributed nearly all of it." He said, "Well, did you lose any of your wagons?" And he goes, "Well, I got back with some of them." And then finally, this man General Winfield Scott Hancock nodded at him and smiled, and he said to him, "Good, but it is the first mule train charge that I've ever knew anything about. You did well, Sergeant. Move your wagons down beyond here into safe territory and report to me in a half an hour." So Jerome A. Waltrus sees General Howard, and then actually meets and talks to Winfield Scott Hancock just about the time he arrives here on the battlefield. And after the war, you know, he would always, when he would speak at veterans engagements, he would always remember that conversation and that one instance that he met General Winfield Scott Hancock, and how Hancock commended him on his mule train charge here at Gettysburg. A good point of reference for this would be, if for any of you genealogists, you can go back and search through the records of the Milwaukee Sunday Telegraph from July 30th, 1882. That's probably the first time that story is being publicly talked about, in 1882. At the time, Waltrus would actually go on to live about another 40 years and die, I think it was 1922. He was born in 1840, and he lived till 1922. So at 1882, he was only about halfway through his life. So this is the story of the mule train charge at Gettysburg with Jerome A. Waltrus, detached from the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.